The morning mist clings to the North Sea like a shroud, and the only sound is the crash of waves against Lindisfarne's rocky shore. Inside the monastery of St. Cuthbert, the monks gather for morning prayer, their voices rising in Latin hymns that have echoed through these stone halls for generations. It's June 8th, 793, and the world is about to crack open. Sister Hild kneels in the small convent adjacent to the monastery, her fingers tracing worn prayer beads. She's 17, her vows barely a year old, her faith as solid as the ancient stones around her. The monastery is her sanctuary, a place of manuscripts and candlelight, where the greatest danger is winter cold or a failed harvest. Beyond these walls, Northumbria stretches green and peaceful under the early summer sun. Then she hears it, a sound that doesn't belong. Not the wind, not the gulls, something else, something wrong. The bell doesn't ring. There's no warning. The doors simply explode inward, splintering like kindling. Men pour through, tall, wild-haired, their eyes blazing with something beyond hunger. They wear leather and iron, carry axes that gleam red in the dawn light. Their voices are thunder in a language that sounds like the sea itself, harsh, guttural, alien. The monks scatter like birds before a storm, but there's nowhere to run. Lindisfarne is an island, and the tide is high. The Vikings move with practiced efficiency, cutting down anyone who resists. Brother Elfred falls at the altar, his blood staining the white cloth. Father Cuthwin, ancient and frail, is struck down mid-prayer, his psalms dying on his lips. Sister Hild runs toward the convent's back chamber, her heart hammering, her breath coming in gasps. Behind her, she hears the screams of the other sisters, Sister Mildred, Sister Edgith, young Elfwin, barely 15. The Vikings are already inside, their laughter cutting through the holy space like axes through flesh. She doesn't make it to the door. A hand, calloused, iron strong, closes around her wrist and yanks her backward. She crashes to the floor, her habit tearing, her head striking stone through blurred vision. She sees him looming above her, a Norseman with braided beard and eyes like winter ice. His axe drips red. His smile is worse than any scream. This isn't a raid. This is a reckoning. The age of the Vikings has begun, and the price will be paid in blood, gold, and broken vows. If you think medieval Europe was all knights and chivalry, you haven't seen what the longships brought to Christian shores. Here on Brutal History, we tear through the romantic myths and resurrect the terror. The monastery floors slick with blood, the nuns dragged to longships, the screams that echoed across the North Sea for 3 centuries. Every view, every like, every subscription pulls another voice from the cold waters of history. Now, let's go back to that morning, because what happened to Sister Hild on the blood-soaked stones of Lindisfarne, what the Vikings did to her and countless other nuns across Christian Europe, was only the beginning of 3 centuries of terror. To understand what happened to Sister Hild, you need to see the world the Vikings shattered with calculated brutality. For centuries, Christian monasteries had stood as beacons of learning and faith across Europe's coastlines. They were undefended by design, places of peace, where monks and nuns devoted themselves to God, far from the violence of feudal wars. Their isolation made them holy. It also made them perfect targets. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't random. It was strategic. The Norse raiders had been watching, planning, studying the tides and the routines. They knew the monastery held treasures, gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts bound in silver. They knew it was defenseless, and they knew exactly when to strike. The Norsemen called themselves Viking, raiders, seafarers, men who sought fortune beyond their harsh Scandinavian homelands. They worshipped gods of war and thunder, valued strength above all, and saw Christian pacifism as weakness begging to be exploited. To them, monasteries weren't sacred spaces. They were warehouses full of plunder guarded by men who refused to fight back. The raid lasted hours, but the terror would echo for lifetimes. The Vikings moved through Lindisfarne like a storm given human form. They smashed reliquaries, their axes ringing against gold. They tore pages from the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of Christianity's greatest treasures, searching for jewels hidden in the binding. What they couldn't carry, they destroyed. What resisted, they killed. Sister Hild lay pinned beneath the Norseman's weight, the stone floor cold against her back. His hands tore at her habit, the wool her mother had blessed before she took her vows. She fought, scratching, kicking, screaming prayers that went unanswered. But he was twice her size, hardened by years at sea and in battle. Her resistance only seemed to amuse him. He spoke words she didn't understand, his breath reeking of mead and salt. When he finished, he simply stood, adjusted his belt, and moved on to the next sister. No acknowledgement, no hesitation. To him, she was spoils of war, no different than a silver cup or a bolt of cloth. Around her, the other nuns suffered the same fate. Sister Mildred, the eldest, was violated by 3 men in succession, her cries eventually fading to silence. Young Ælfwine didn't survive. Whether from injuries or shock, Hild would never know. She simply stopped moving, her eyes staring at nothing, blood pooling beneath her torn robes. This wasn't unique to Lindisfarne. It was doctrine. In Norse culture, women captured in raids became thralls, slaves. But nuns held special value. They were educated, often literate, trained in weaving and herbalism. More importantly, they were Christian virgins, sworn to God. To defile them wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It shattered the faith of entire communities, proving that the Christian God couldn't protect even his most devoted servants. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by traumatized monks, described Lindisfarne's sack in apocalyptic terms. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. But what happened to the nuns was written in euphemisms, if at all. The sisters were taken was the most detail the chroniclers would provide. The truth was too shameful, too brutal to record in holy texts. After the initial violence, the Vikings began the systematic looting. They stripped the altar of its gold, pried gems from crosses, and loaded their longships with everything of value. The monks and nuns who survived the slaughter faced a worse fate: chains. Sister Hild was dragged to the beach with the other survivors. her wrists bound with rough rope that cut into her skin. The longships waited in the surf, their dragon-headed prows seeming to sneer at the smoking monastery behind them. She counted maybe 15 sisters still alive, along with a handful of monks. The rest lay dead in the ruins or were too injured to move. The Vikings shoved them aboard like cargo. The ships were cramped, reeking of fish and tar. Hild was chained to a rowing bench, squeezed between Sister Edgith and a young monk she didn't recognize. As the oars bit into the water and Lindisfarne shrank into the mist, she realized she would never see England again. The voyage to Scandinavia was a nightmare of days bleeding into nights. The captives were given minimal food, stale bread, dried fish, and water so brackish it burned the throat. The Vikings used the women whenever the mood struck, often in full view of the other captives. Sister Edgith stopped speaking after the second day. The young monk tried to lead prayers until a Norseman beat him silent. Hild endured by retreating inward, reciting scripture in her mind, clinging to the words like driftwood in a storm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But with each violation, each humiliation, the words felt more hollow. Where was God in the longship's hold? Where was salvation in the chains? They arrived at a settlement in what would later be called Norway, a cluster of longhouses huddled against fjord cliffs, smoke rising from their turf roofs. A market had formed on the beach, not for fish or furs, but for people. The captives were paraded before potential buyers, Norse chieftains, wealthy farmers, even other raiders looking for labor. Hild stood on a wooden platform, her torn habit barely covering her, her body covered in bruises. Men examined her teeth, her hands, discussed her worth in a language that sounded like gravel and ice. A Jarl, a Norse nobleman, purchased her along with Sister Edgith and 2 monks. The price? 12 silver coins and a bolt of English wool, likely looted from another raid. They were led away in chains, property now, their vows to God severed by pagan swords. This was the Viking Age's hidden trade. While sagas celebrated warriors and explorers, beneath it all was an economy built on slavery. Monasteries weren't just sources of gold, they were harvests of human beings. The Jarl's estate sprawled across a windswept valley, longhouses clustered like sleeping beasts beneath mountains that clawed at grey skies. Hild's new world was timber and smoke, animal hides, and the constant smell of the sea. She worked from dawn until darkness, hauling water, grinding grain, weaving cloth on looms that made her fingers bleed. The Jarl's wife, a hard-eyed woman named Astrid, oversaw the thralls with ruthless efficiency. Any hesitation earned a blow. Any prayer spoken aloud earned worse. Hild learned quickly that survival meant silence. She bent her back to labor, kept her eyes down, and buried her faith so deep, even she sometimes forgot it existed. Sister Edgith wasn't as fortunate. She continued to pray openly, crossing herself before meals, whispering psalms while working. One morning, Astrid had her dragged to the center of the settlement and beaten with birch rods until she couldn't stand a warning to the other Christian thralls. "Your God has no power here." The Vikings didn't just enslave bodies, they aimed to break spirits, Christian captives were forced to participate in pagan rituals, to serve meat at feasts honoring Thor and Odin, to watch as their captors mocked the crucifixion. Some broke completely, renouncing their faith to ease their suffering. Others, like Eadgith, held firm until death claimed them. Most existed somewhere between, their souls hollowed out by years of degradation. Hild endured 5 years in that settlement, 5 years of labor, violation, and erasure. The Jarl used her whenever he pleased, sometimes in front of his wife, sometimes alone in the darkness of the longhouse. She bore him no children, whether by God's mercy or her body's trauma, she never knew. Other nuns weren't as fortunate. Across Scandinavia, captured Christian women gave birth to children who would never know their mother's faith. Raised as Norse, their English or Irish or Frankish blood diluted into the Viking world. But Hild remembered. In the rare moments of solitude, she would trace crosses in the dirt and whisper fragments of scripture. She taught other Christian thralls the Lord's Prayer in hushed tones while working the fields. She kept a scrap of cloth from her original habit hidden in her shoe, a tattered reminder that she had once been Sister Hild of Lindisfarne, not just the English thrall. The raids continued year after year. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow fell. In 795, Iona was sacked, its monks slaughtered or enslaved. The pattern spread like plague. Ireland, Scotland, Francia, even Spain. Anywhere Christian communities gathered near water, the longships came. The Vikings refined their tactics, learning which monasteries held the most wealth, which seasons offered the best raiding conditions, which captives fetched the highest prices in Norse markets. By the mid-800s, the slave trade was so robust that entire economies depended on it. Dublin became a major slave hub, its markets overflowing with Irish monks and nuns. The Norse settlement at York traded English captives like livestock. Constantinople's markets received Scandinavian merchants bringing Christian slaves from the north. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate hundreds of thousands were enslaved during the Viking Age, though exact figures are lost to time. The violence wasn't random brutality. It was systematic economic exploitation wrapped in cultural and religious domination. To the Norse, Christians were huskarlar, house slaves, useful for their skills but contemptible for their weakness. The fact that many were monks and nuns, sworn to pacifism, made them ideal victims. They wouldn't fight back. They would pray instead of resist. Their god, the Vikings learned, did nothing to protect them. Some nuns did resist. In 870, when Vikings raided the monastery at Coldingham in Scotland, Abbess Ebba gathered her nuns and made a horrifying choice. Rather than face violation and slavery, they mutilated themselves, cutting off their noses and lips, disfiguring their faces beyond recognition. When the Vikings arrived and saw the blood-soaked sisters, they were so enraged they burned the monastery with everyone inside. The church later canonized Ebba as a martyr. But her choice speaks to the desperation that Viking raids inspired. Hild never returned to England. She died in the Jarl's household sometime in her 30s, the exact year unrecorded, her death unmarked by any Christian burial. She was buried in a shallow grave on the edge of the settlement, no cross to mark her resting place, no prayers to commend her soul. Just another thrall who wore out her usefulness. But her story, and thousands like it, survived in fragments, in the traumatized writings of monks who witnessed raids, in archaeological evidence, Norse graves containing Christian artifacts, settlements with clear signs of enslaved foreign populations, in the DNA studies showing significant British and Irish ancestry in modern Scandinavian populations, evidence of the women taken and absorbed into Norse bloodlines, in the sagas themselves, which occasionally mentioned Christian thralls, though always as property, never as people. The Viking Age lasted roughly 3 centuries, from 793 to 1066. By its end, the Norse had converted to Christianity themselves, their raids transformed into settlements, their descendants becoming the Normans who would conquer England. The violence faded, but the scars remained. Entire monastic traditions were destroyed, generations of knowledge burned or lost, communities shattered, and countless women like Sister Hild erased into slavery, their vows broken by axes and chains. The modern world remembers Vikings as adventurers, explorers, even heroes. We celebrate their craftsmanship, their seafaring prowess. Their mythology museums display their longships with reverence. Television shows romanticize their culture. But beneath the horned helmets and dramatic sagas lies a truth most would rather forget. The Viking Age was built on terror, and its economy ran on the broken bodies of Christian captives. This isn't just history. It's a wound disguised as adventure. Here on Brutal History, we don't let the longships sail away from their crimes. We name the violence. We resurrect the voices of the nuns who died in monastery courtyards and the sisters who rotted in Norse chains. We remember Sister Hild, whose real name is lost, but whose suffering echoes across 1,000 forgotten graves. The monasteries may be ruins, but the truth is ours to carry. Subscribe and keep the bells of Lindisfarne ringing.